This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Supreme Court verdict on the freebies culture. The participants are B.L. Srinivasan, legal expert, and Arjun J. Chaudhary, journalist.
On the issue of freebies, that is before the Supreme Court, a three-judge bench headed by Chief Justice N.V. Ramanna gave some very important observations on this issue, which has required extensive hearing, especially on the subsidy grants by a state government without full responsibility in terms of the fiscal responsibility of the state and the promises that the political party has made before coming to power in the government itself. On this issue and what the Supreme Court has observed and what are the consequences of the Supreme Court's observation, we are now joined by Sri R. Srinivasan. Mr. Srinivasan, what is the importance of this particular issue before the Supreme Court right now, which was in fact televised for the very first time to make the hearings as transparent as possible on the issue of freebies?
I think it's absolutely critical because if you look at the state of public finances, particularly of the state governments, the challenge becomes very, very apparent here. Every state government and to a large extent the central government itself, because if you look at the deficit, right, every government is living beyond its means, which means that it is spending much more money than it is raising by way of revenue. That's not normally a problem, because governments being sovereign have the ability to raise debt at very low risk and therefore low cost. And running a deficit is a well-tested way of actually achieving your developmental goals, because if you had to simply cut your cloth to what you had in hand, you might not be able to meet your developmental ambitions. So therefore, spending a little bit beyond your means to get to where you want to go is fine. The problem comes when you're spending without having a clear goal in mind, or the goal is not necessarily one which is a productive and economically productive goal. So that's where the whole issue of freebies comes in, because freebies by themselves are not morally a problem. Right? In a society which has a lot of inequality, some form of distributive justice, which includes actually, providing something to some segments of society which cannot otherwise access a basic service or a requirement. It could be housing, it could be water, it could be food, it is education, in some cases healthcare. That's perfectly fine, and I think that should be the goal of a just and equitable society. The problem comes when these, some of the outcomes are not in that sense easily justifiable, and this is where the question of politically motivated freebies comes in, what so-called popular revdi culture, which is to cater to perhaps certain small groups and not the larger public as a whole, and mainly for a political outcome by way of electoral returns in terms of votes. And that's where your problem comes in, because then if the goal is to win an election, then the economic viability of that freebie becomes open to question. That is part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that when you sort of use your power, because you're in office, you've been elected to run the government and you therefore have the power to take decisions, when you use that power to actually take decisions which are in narrow self-interest, which is in your electoral interest, but not in the larger public interest, which is what you're elected to do, then you have a problem. Particularly where the accountability is not yours, right? If a businessman decides to spend beyond his means or take a risk beyond what is sustainable, the business fails, he pays the price for it. But when it comes to governments and elected officials, there is, the payback is not visible immediately. Society as a whole pays, but not the person who has taken probably an improperly thought through or an unjustifiable decision. I think that was the subject of this petition, which was before the Supreme Court, that I don't think that it was to restrain freebies, but it was to restrain freebies without having a financial plan to back them up. And I think the court has sort of observed that this should be kept in mind, and in my view it is a very, very critical observation that without financial responsibility and accountability, we do need to have some kind of control for this.
Mr. Srinivasan, so clearly the issue is on the nature of the freebie or the subsidy which is granted by the government for the benefit of the public. What is that nature? Because you have the provision in the Constitution under the directive principles of state policy. India is a welfare state. The states within the Union of India have a responsibility of ensuring the welfare of their citizens. However, the Supreme Court did observe that even if it's for the public good, there has to be a clear categorization of the state being able to meet that promise, make the economy viable and not be on the verge of imminent bankruptcy. You mentioned that. Then how does one understand the nature of the freebies if the standard is a fiscal responsibility that cannot be dispensed with under the guise of electoral promises?
Yes, and why is fiscal responsibility important? Because you're actually passing the burden onto the future generations, right? You are spending money which you don't have today, and you're borrowing to spend that, but the responsibility for repaying does not rest on your shoulders, it is on the future generations, and therefore it's a societal problem. When governments start doing this, it becomes a societal problem because the burden is passed on to the larger community, and it's a non-sustainable solution. And therefore I think it is very, very important that this element of fiscal responsibility, having goals, the goals by themselves can be very good and valid. So if you want to say, I want to eradicate hunger, I want to ensure that nobody in this country, no citizen goes hungry, it's a perfectly valid goal. But how much resources can you devote to it? You can only devote the resources that you have. If you don't have the resources, then you cannot do it. So for instance, we have several rights, right? We have a Food Security Act, which makes access to food a basic right. We have a Right to Education Act, which makes access to education right. But do we have the resources to deliver on those rights? I think that's what I think that we as a country need to also consider. And therefore, instead of making them rights which are not really deliverable or enforceable, can we set them as national goals and work our way towards them? For instance, the Food Security Act is being implemented right now. 80 million families are being given free rations by the government. It was a provision which was brought in during the COVID period, but it's been extended. But we have a huge food production surplus, and therefore we're managing to sustain it. Whether it can be sustained indefinitely or not, do we have the resources for that? That's again, these are collective decisions which have to be taken because it is the center, it's the various state governments which contribute to this. They all have to take a decision. So you can have these goals and you can have these ambitions to deliver certain goods or services to all members of society, but without having the financial picture clearly visible and the accountability for these decisions. See, that is important. The accountability has to be here and now, not at some future date by somebody else, in which case then irresponsible decisions have no consequences. And I think that's really the issue here.
Mr. Srinivasan, you mentioned about how the future generation would be affected if subsidy go out of control. There is no fiscal responsibility. You have the FREEBIES Act for the center. Is there one for the state? And a subsidy payout which is not viable or tenable under the present dispensation also affects the present generation because taxation does go up.
Absolutely. So everybody pays the price, but who gets the benefit? I mean, and also many of these subsidies or freebies, the delivery is very spotty and uneven. You make these promises, you don't deliver on it or not entirely or not. The process is not transparent. There is no audit. There is no accountability. And there is also led to other undesirable developments. There's a huge amount of diversion. We've been spending a significant portion of our budget for development and public welfare right from the time that we became an independent country, and now we are celebrating 75 years of independent existence. But have we managed to actually achieve the outcomes of all that money which has been spent so far, allegedly in the name of the poor or in the name of development? No. And you and I know the reasons for that. Therefore, I think, the question of public accountability and having an institutional mechanism to enforce this accountability becomes important. Therefore, I think we do need some kind of an institutional setup. The center does have the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, and therefore it is mandated, for instance, that it cannot dictate that you cannot have a deficit of more than 3% of GDP. And during the pandemic, we did run a much higher deficit for 2 years or 3 years, but that required a special dispensation from Parliament. There was debate, there was discussion, and there was a sort of unanimous acceptance of the need to run a higher deficit. When you make informed decisions, it's fine. At least then you've had a public discussion, you've had debate, and you're aware of the consequences, but you're also aware of the need to do certain things. And once you've discussed that and you've taken an informed decision, that's fine. And there's still an accountability, so there has to be a glide path to come back to 3% of GDP deficit levels and so on. But at the state level, this is not being implemented, and so therefore running larger and larger deficits without really having a clear picture before you of how you plan to reduce it, how you plan to raise additional revenues, or how do you plan to reduce expenditure. That's the other side, which is never discussed or debated. So expenditure also includes all kinds of freebies and subsidies. So where do you cut subsidies, how you cut subsidies, where you spend. So the difference between productive and non-productive expenditure, and not all non-productive expenditure, as I mentioned earlier, is necessarily bad. You need to do that just to ensure a higher level of welfare, and that's the whole goal. India has a goal of becoming a developed nation by 2047 when we celebrate 100 years as a country. And that's a laudable goal. Why shouldn't we be a developed country? Why shouldn't the average Indian enjoy the same quality of life and standards and services as the citizen of any developed economy in the world today? That's fine. But we do need to have a plan to get there, and we do need to be aware of how we are going to raise the resources in order to achieve that status. So I think that's the central issue here.
Clearly, it appears that there's a legal framework for the center to be accountable for its expenditures under the FRBM Act, but it's pretty sketchy as far as the state governments are concerned. Chief Justice of India N.V. Ramanna also observed that populism is the motive behind offering these electoral promises to the public when they come to power, and they seem to get a competitive advantage by living up to those promises without ensuring fiscal responsibility. So from the political point of view, how can this be tackled? These are promises made under the manifesto. So how does it be tackled at the state level?
I think it requires a multi-pronged approach. I think certainly, the Election Commission, which sort of controls the electoral process in this country, the gatekeeper, it needs to play a role in this. We have rules and regulations for everything. So, we have regulations on how much money can be spent. There is a model code of conduct and so on. But and everybody has found workarounds to get around those, right? So the problem is not in not having a rule book, but the problem is in implementation. So I think Election Commission has a role to play, but Election Commission can only play that role if there is across the board consensus at the level of the political class that you need to do this. As long as one section or the other sees an immediate payoff without the possibility of an immediate punishment, this will continue to happen. So therefore, I think there has to be a more informed and I would say a higher level of debate and discussion amongst the political parties, and there has to be a broad-based consensus that these are certain things that all of us as a collective will not do. That's the only way that this can work.
Finally, Mr. Srinivasan, the bench has heard it under Chief Justice of India, Shri N.V. Ramanna. He has now retired. What is going to be the future of this matter before the Supreme Court of India? We have a Chief Justice of India designate, Shri Lalit. How do you see the matter being proceeded finally and very briefly?
The matter has been referred to a three-judge bench and it will come up again for this day. But in my view, this is not an issue where a judicial solution is really possible. This is not the area of the judiciary's responsibility. It's the area of the executive's responsibility. And I have a feeling that, eventually the Supreme Court in its wisdom will give some sort of directions to this effect. Recognize the need for a solution. They've even suggested the lines, sort of hinted at the way you can do this, but I think they will leave the solution for the executive to develop.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. B.L. Srinivasan, for speaking extensively on this difficult issue of freebies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on Supreme Court verdict on the freebies culture. The participants were B.L. Srinivasan, legal expert, and Arjun J. Chaudhary, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.